you have your Bible, you can turn to Mark chapter 15. It's good to see all of you this morning. It's good to have visitors with us. Of course, a lot of visitors, family, and we're thankful that you're here with us and worshiping with us right now. Mark 15:43 is right after Jesus has died. And Joseph of Arimathea wants to claim the body of Moses, the body of Jesus. Jesus has been taken, basically by an angry mob, empowered by the Sanhedrin. They've got Pilate, the governor of the land's agreement with it, and old Joseph of Arimathea all by himself. We learn with John, probably with Nicodemus too, have the guts to go up and ask Pilate, can we have the body of Jesus? And there's interesting, especially I think the way the New King James reads that. If you look at verse 42, now when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, prominent council member, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God, coming and taking courage, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate marveled that he was already dead and summoned the centurion. He asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. And you look at verse 46 or the end, Joseph wraps him in fine linen and takes him to his personal private tomb, hewn out of stone. What courage to have to do something like that. It's amazing to me. The Sanhedrin obviously has no problem with murdering anybody. Pilate has no problem with allowing the murdering to happen. And yet Joseph of Arimathea has the courage to go ask for the body of Jesus. And he does it. And I think I can make this very simple point from that. Courage gets things done. It accomplishes things. And I think that's why Matthew praises Joseph for doing it. And of course, I know God could have found a different way, but our whole story of him being in the tomb and then coming 3 days later and being resurrected from the dead, how is that all pulled off here? Well, it's because Joseph went and got the body. That's how that was pulled off. So Jesus wasn't thrown in some ditch with everybody else that was crucified that week. And there's something very impressive about that. So what I wanted to do this morning is just analyze this concept of courage, and mainly just how courage is what gets us to accomplish things in this life, and even very spiritual goals. I think like Joseph of Arimathea here waiting on the kingdom of God. Courage gets things done. And I have 4 thoughts that goes along with this. The first one we just read, courage received the body of Jesus. But as well, we see courage in the New Testament in Epaphroditus. Courage is what brought Paul support while terribly sick. Look at Philippians 2 with me. We're going to do a lot of bouncing around and reading. Philippians 2, Philippians seems to be a thank you letter for support while Paul's in prison. And Paul tells the Philippians that Epaphroditus, the carrier of that support, apparently got so sick that he almost died when he was trying to deliver it to Paul. But he pushed on anyhow and was able to deliver the support. In verse 25 of Philippians 2, he says, "Yet I considered it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost unto death, but God had mercy on him. And not only on him, but on me also, lest I should sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem, because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his own life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me." Was it courageous for Epaphroditus to go and deliver that support to Paul even while he was sick? Well, it doesn't say courage in this passage. But if you look at that last thing we read in verse 30, this is a guy who, for the work of Christ, became close to death, not regarding his own life, to supply what was lacking in this service. Is that courageous? Well, did not Joseph of Arimathea not consider his own life, but go and do what needed to be done because it was going to be a work of service? Well, yeah. And I can safely say what Epaphroditus did here was courageous. That he did not regard his own life, but went ahead and what did he do? He got something done that needed to be done, which is delivering that support from Paul. You know, I've always thought this was interesting. You know, usually when we talk about courageous things in the New Testament, it's always like fear of persecution is the issue. And you were courageous and you overcame the persecution. Is Epaphroditus afraid of persecution here? No, the fear is just getting sick and dying. And yet that was even something that needed to be overcome. Some of us do know, some of us don't know, some of us will know one day. But there are very few things worse than debilitating sickness. And I'm talking about the times that we've been sick or will be sick, where we're in such bad shape, it is hard to do anything. It becomes a chore to do anything. And many of you know, when you're hurting, and I'm talking about when you're hurting bad, what's the only thing you can think about? You can think about how you're hurting, or you're constantly trying to drive some kind of scheme so you won't be hurting anymore. And that's all you can be concerned with, right? Was Epaphroditus obviously hurting so bad, that's probably the only thing he could be consumed with? Yeah, I imagine it was if he was really that sick that he was close to death. But what did he still do? He still was able to push through enough, at least to get this particular job done. And that's why these men have to be held in such high esteem. Do we need to do the same thing today? I think we do. And let me do two sides of the coin here. When we have brethren that have debilitating problems, and I know of some, right? There are some things that will just tear you up. We can have cancer, and those things can be debilitating, right? People have Crohn's. That is a disease that's debilitating. And we go on and on about things that really will absolutely dominate your life. And yet, you have brethren that still find ways to have 20, 30 minutes burst of energy where they can do some kind of spiritual work. Should we hold those people in esteem? Yeah, we should. And honestly, that's courageous, isn't it? Because your body's telling you, don't do anything anymore. You're, retired, even retired from spiritual work, and you need to be completely consumed. But when someone has the gall, say, you know what? I'm going to find 20 minutes or 30 minutes here where I can do this spiritual work, or I can find an hour to come to church. Should we hold those people in esteem? Yes, we should. Because at the end of the day, that thing is courageous, isn't it? And sometimes we need to be courageous. Let me show you the other side of the coin, though. There are times where things are absolutely debilitating and it really is difficult to do anything. There are other times when we act like things are debilitating, when we really just need to show some courage and come to church. Those are two different sides of the coin, is it there? And I'll be honest, I don't think we as a congregation are there where we used to be. Where we used to be, and many of y'all know this, I don't think this is a secret. We had like 30 people that were shut in years ago that were not shut in. Like, it was kind of obvious they weren't shut in because you see them at Walmart, right? And you would think like, if you are in such debilitating sickness that you can't come to services and sit in a pew for an hour, but you can go walk around Walmart for an hour, you can kind of see that kind of hypocritical, isn't it? Is that courageous? And when I see the brother at Walmart, do I say, I need to hold you in esteem because you were so courageous that you came to Walmart today? No, we don't hold those people in esteem. We're confused. When those same people, though, find time to come to services, they find time to do some kind of spiritual work, they find time to encourage someone, do we hold those people in esteem? No. We do, because that's when we say this is like Epaphroditus. Does courage get things done? Courage does get things done. And again, I understand there's waves of that, there's different levels of that. We got to figure out what we can do with what we have, and we're all at different ranges of being terribly sick. But certainly, there's at least little courageous things we can do, and we do hold those people in high esteem. Courage corrected Apollos about baptism, didn't it? Let's look at Acts 18. This is Aquila and Priscilla. Apollos apparently was very knowledgeable in the scriptures, and he preached, and there was a lot of wonderful things he taught, but he only knew the baptism of John. We get to verse 24 here. This is in Corinth. Now, a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man has been instructed in the way of the Lord and has been fervent in spirit. He spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he only knew the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Did that take courage for Aquila and Priscilla to do that? I think it did. And you've got to think as well, here's a guy who, A, he knows this stuff. Number two, he evidently has been somehow well received by the synagogue. And three, is this a timid guy or is this a bold guy? This is a pretty bold guy. And even Luke says, he spoke boldly in the synagogue. Is that a man that's hard to confront? I think that is a man that's hard to confront. But what do Aquila and Priscilla have the courage to do? They have the courage to take him aside and say, hey, can we talk about this? I think there's some things you don't know about. And evidently, we're glad he did because that was very well received. And Apollos became a preacher of the gospel there. And of course, it begs the question, when I have always been taught courage, I've heard sermons of courage, where did we go to first? Well, we went to Joshua, and we'll read Joshua later, and we think about courage is Joshua confronting the Canaanites and going and fighting them in battle. And we think to ourselves, or maybe Andrew just thinks to himself, you know what, I could probably do that. like we think, yeah, if I was with Joshua, I've been there right with him, right? And we kind of live off that fantasy land. I can't do that though, and at the same time, be too afraid to talk to my friends at work about baptism. You see how that's an oxymoron there? I can't read Joshua and think, wow, I would have done that with Joshua. I would have gone off with Joshua. I would have crossed the sea. I would have fought the Canaanites. I would have seen the hailstones. But then at the same time, when my coworker is talking about baptism, I'm too scared to pull him aside and talk to him about it. That's not courageous. But courage is when you do hear bold people say things about the Bible that aren't in the Bible, that you do have the courage to say, hey, can I talk to you a moment about that? And even privately here, where you're not trying to embarrass somebody, you're just trying to give them more information. Aquila and Priscilla were courageous when they corrected Apollos about baptism. And here's no more, and let's get to them. Courage allowed Joshua and Caleb to be different, right? Numbers 14, the spies have already come out into the land. They've come back, they've given a bad report. Caleb's given a good report. And now the people have decided that they're going to appoint a leader other than Moses to take them back to Egypt. And I guess they're going to go be slaves again to Pharaoh. Who knows what the thinking is here? But look at how Joshua and Caleb react. If I start here in verse 6 of 14, it says, but Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread, their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Now that's that let's go speech, isn't it? Like the Lord is with us, let us not fear him. They are our bread, their support is gone. Let's go take the land. Now you telling you, if you give a good speech like that, what are you expecting? You expecting that you just rallied the people. And they're all like, let's go, right? Let's go. What do we get in verse 10? And the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. These fools hear an incredible speech about courage. And what do they decide to do? They're going to kill the guys that gave the speech. And apparently it's so bad, the Lord himself actually intervenes and appears down at the tabernacle to make them all put their rocks down, right? Courage is what allowed Joshua and Caleb to be different, especially when those differences were not accepted. And there's so many different paths we could go to with that, but let's just face it and move on. One of the things we all struggle with the most is we don't want to be different. We do not like to stand out. We do not like to say, I'm sorry, I can't participate in that. We don't like telling people, I'm sorry, I need to go and I need to leave and I need to participate in this. I know none of y'all else are. We don't even like praying for our food if we're eating with people that don't pray for their food. We don't like being different. Well, Joshua and Caleb, they were different. And why were they different? because they had the courage from the Lord to be different. And of course, that takes courage. And certainly their courage came from the Lord, and certainly it was not accepted. And I don't think we should expect our courage to be accepted either. You see, I got these 4 things on the screen here, and all I try to do with this is just kind of present a model, right? What is courage we see in the Bible? Well, courage receives the body of Jesus. Courage does something even when it's terribly sick. Courage corrects others about the doctrine of Christ. Courage dares to be different, right? Even if they're going to murder you. And we see this painted out throughout the Old and the New Testament as this long story. But what's the key to unlock all this? Because obviously we could go 1,000 different ways. We can make the message very clear. Courage is what gets things done. Well, okay, how do I unlock that? How am I one of these people that gets things done, like Aquila and Priscilla or Joshua or Caleb? Well, that's where I want to move into this. And I think this is a pretty bold claim, but I think the more I'm reading these passages I'm about to present, I think I'm right about this. Courage is more about faith than it is personality. And especially when we're talking about biblical courage here that we've been reading about. It doesn't have a lot to do with this, like, I'm a type A, I'm a type B, I'm naturally timid, I'm naturally confident. It really doesn't have anything to do with that. And the reason why I know it doesn't have anything to do with that is the Bible really never even talks about it, right? Like, do we start out reading Joshua chapter 1, and we'll read that in just a moment. Does the Lord begin with, all right, Joshua, I know some people are type A and some people are type B. Joshua, you're a type A, so I've selected. Now that's ridiculous, right? And we don't do these things anymore. Y'all remember like 10, 15 years ago, we'd all take Facebook surveys. And you know what it was? The Chinese and the Russians were data mining us when we were taking those surveys. But we'd all post it, and say, well, look, I'm a type this person. And I'm a number 12. And I'm a very confident person. It's funny, none of those Facebook surveys ever told you were a terrible person. No one posted like, well, it says I'm a terrible person. And I'm a dummy. You didn't see anybody share that. But the Russians still got all your information, didn't they? You don't see God talking about that one bit. And the reason why I think you don't see God talking about that one bit is because he understands the kind of courage he's looking for is not a personality courage. It's a faithful courage. It's a faith that is willing to do what's right, even when it's fearful to do what's right. And let's read Joshua 1. And many of you already know the answer to this question. But where did Joshua's courage come from? Well, there's no mention of his personality. The only thing that's mentioned there is his believing trust in God. Look here in verse 7. God says, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from the right hand or the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. The book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate it on day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you, be strong and of good courage? Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Where does Joshua's courage come from? Well, I think it comes through the various things that God keeps on bringing up in the statement, right? What is he going to be courageous to do in verse 7? Well, to observe everything in the law, right? Look at verse 8. What is he going to be courageous about? This is the book of the law, and it shall not depart from your mouth. And then finally there at the end of verse 9, do not be afraid or dismayed. Why? Because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. If you don't know the law, and you don't read the book, and you don't have faith that God is with you wherever you go, are you going to have courage? No, you can't have courage, right? At least the courage we're talking about. You might be confident, you might be self-confident, you could be overconfident, but you're not going to have courage. Because courage comes from this idea that, hey, God is with me, I know God's book, and I try to observe God's law. That's where courage comes from. I have fellowship with God, God has fellowship with me, and I believe that God will preserve me, and he will give me good success wherever I go. And if you don't have that mindset, are you going to have courage? No, you're not, right? Are you going to be able to pull things off even when you're sick, even a little bit? No, you won't if you don't have faith, right? Are you going to be able to be courageous, to be different if you don't believe God's with you? Well, you can't. This courage only comes from faith. It doesn't come from personality. It's because the Lord God is with you wherever you go. And let me compare this passage to 2 Timothy chapter 1, which if this is the most famous bravery passage, well, this is the second. 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul is talking to Timothy about the spiritual gift that he was given by the laying on the hands of the apostles. And for some whatever reason, Timothy's not exercising that gift, and it must be because he's timid. And Paul addresses that, right? You get to verse 7, verse 1. I'm just going to read the first phrase here first. For God did not give us a spirit of fear. And in some versions, what else do you have there? Some of you have, God did not give us a spirit of cowardice. Some of us have, God did not give us a spirit of timidity. And of us that were in the small auditorium, we did Revelation 21 today. What did we talk about in verse 8? You know, who's the first group on the list that's going to go to hell? It's the cowardice, right? And the reason why is that's not from God. God didn't teach you to be cowardly. God didn't teach you to be timid. God did not give us a spirit of fear. That's not of him because he's not cowardly, right? Are there going to be times as a Christian that I'm going to have to do what's right even when it's not easy? Guys, that's basically the thesis of what we're doing here, right? Y'all, I don't come to church because it's easy. It's not easy anymore. I come to church because it's right? You know, there's times when we have brethren here that lose family, they lose loved ones, and they'll have a visitation or a funeral. And when are those funerals and visitations usually held? They're held like in the middle of the day. They just had to held it whenever they could, right? When I go to these visitations, do I go because it's easy, it's a piece of cake? No, we go because it's right. And there was something I even wanted to use, but with the Romans, right, in Acts, it's when the Romans come to Three Inns and they meet Paul there as a prisoner that says Paul took courage because he saw the brethren. Their presence helped with that. They did that because that was right. And at the end of the day, we've got to make decisions about what I'm doing, not about whether my personality won't allow me to, but instead about what's the right thing to do in this particular situation. I'll remember and I'll never forget, and I'm not going to use names to protect the innocent. I remember being like 23 years old in Tuscaloosa. We were having like a college Bible study. And the guy led the study. He was done. He was wrapping it up. And like a lot of us do, he wanted to have a closing prayer. So he asked one of the guys that was, went to school with us and went to church with us. And we all knew this guy. This guy had been a Christian since high school. He's been a Christian for a really long time, We're all in our 20s. And he looks at this guy and he says, hey, you. And he said the name. He said, will you dismiss us in a prayer? That kid froze. And I'll never forget his face. He was just looking at the guy speaking like this. And the guy speaking just looked at him back. And next thing we know, we're all sitting here, and it's not 30 minutes. It feels like it's 30 minutes. And they're doing a staring contest to see who's going to blink first. What I'm impressed with is the guy who was teaching didn't back down. He just kept on looking at him. And my old buddy here that didn't want to pray, he couldn't even mouth the words, would you get somebody else? And personally, I'm okay with that. When I teach Bible class, I don't ask, would anyone like to read? Would anybody like to pray? I just tell, because I hate that little brief silence when I'm like, would anybody like to read? Anybody? I don't like doing that. I just say, hey, will you read, right? And I do that same with pray. Will you pray? And I'm perfectly okay with brothers saying, would you pick somebody else? And I'll go, yes, and I will pick somebody else. You don't have to tell me why. I'm okay with that. But this guy wouldn't even say, would you pick somebody else? He just froze. And in my mind, guys, I've worked through all of this in my head, and I'm still watching these guys stare at each other. And finally, Andrew feels like he's got to fix it. That's my own problem. I feel like I got to fix everything. And I raise my hand and go, I'll pray. And so the guy teaching listens to me and goes, okay, well, Andrew, will you say a prayer for us? And I prayed. So I get in the car with my buddies. I know this has turned into a longer story it should be. And we're driving home. And me, I want to defend my buddy that was too scared to pray. I'm like, look, maybe something was going on. I don't know what the deal was. Maybe he didn't have the advantages I had growing up. I'm trying to give him everything I can to defend this guy that was too scared. And one of the girls in the car, one of the sisters, she starts tearing this guy to pieces about him being too afraid to pray. I mean, she's letting him have it. And let's face it, this is general, but a lot of you sisters are pretty brutal about us when we lead in services. You can be pretty hard critics sometimes. And she's just letting him have it. And I'm trying to defend him. And this is what she tells me, and this is the part that I never really forget. She said, Andrew, my daddy was the same way. She said, if you look at my dad was born the most timid person that has ever existed on this earth. And apparently her dad had instilled in her this thought, and this is the thought that really is helpful. Her dad was naturally timid, and I know her dad. He is naturally timid. And she said there was a time in his life where after church services, as soon as they said amen, he would go run and sit in the car. And then later when he got married, he would go run and sit in the car and then wait for his wife to come get in the car so they could go home. And the reason why he'd go and sit in the car is he didn't want to have to talk to anybody. He was too timid to talk to anybody. And people would ask, like, hey, we need somebody to handle this. We need somebody to do this. Not him. He was too timid to even volunteer. And finally, what he did is he came to a realization that if he was going to stay that timid, he was not going to go to heaven. That's finally the realization he came to. And it wasn't the timidity part. It was the part that he didn't do anything. He didn't serve. He didn't practice things. He wasn't helpful to others. He didn't do anything. He had just been a sitting Christian. And he's like, I can't be a sitting Christian. And so what he did, he's an engineer. He made himself like a data sheet of what he was going to do to work himself out of this. So he basically literally had his watch, and he would say, okay, after services for 5 minutes, I'm going to stand in the foyer. And so he would go back there and he would stand in the foyer, and 5 minutes up, he'd run to the car, right? And once he got himself a little bit more and more comfortable, he kind of extended out his time, and he would try to make new challenges for himself. Why is it so important that if we were that timid, we would try to work on things enough, not so we're extroverts or anything like that, I'm not trying to say that, but we would do at least enough where we could participate. Well, the reason why we have to do things like that is because of this verse. For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. And I like the last phrase instead, and of self-control. God did not teach us to be afraid of everything. God taught us about power and about love and about self-control. That's what he taught us. And sometimes it takes self-control and love to force myself out there just so I could do something, right? And again, make your own decisions about where you're at, where you need to be. But there is a concept here that courage is more about faith than it is personality. We don't have to hide behind our personalities. And I'm not necessarily telling you got to be an extrovert. But we do have to have enough faith where we can participate. We can do the practices. We can serve others because that's what God taught us to do. And finally here, courage has a tender heart. And I think what we need to do is we need to show the opposite side of the coin here. Because if courage has a tender heart, that means that courage is not brash. And there's a big difference in my mind between brashness and courage. Brashness is the idea of someone that's so overconfident, they dominate every single person in the room that they're in. And they take advantage of others, they're rude, they're cruel because they couldn't care less. Because they've got way too much confidence. Is that courage? That's not God's courage. That's not the one he taught. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2 with me. I think we get a great example there of God's courage. 1 Peter chapter 2. And maybe, well, not maybe, here is the depiction of the most courageous thing. It's Christ going to the cross. In 1 Peter 2:21, he says, "For this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we could follow in his footsteps." You know, what was the purpose of this? It was to leave us an example. This is how it's done. This is how you get things done. Verse 22, "Who committed no sin, nor deceit was found in his mouth, who when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins on his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." Here's the Christ. He left us an example. And when he was obviously fearful, he tried to get the cup passed from him, yet he still submitted to the will of God because he did what God needed to be done. And now, was he brash about it? Because let's face it, I see Jesus as someone that has a lot of confidence. When you talk to him, I'd be scared to talk to Jesus because of how confident he is when he talks. But I never catch Jesus being brash. When people reviled him, was he brash back? No, he did not revile in return. When he was abused, did he abuse back? No, he didn't do those things. Why? Because God's courage is not brash. It's tender-hearted, isn't it? And I think it leads to this. Ultimately, what is God's courage? Real courage. Well, courage sacrifices for others. And that's the opposite of brashness, but that is what we see here in 1 Peter 1. 1 Peter 2. Whoops. This is what real courage looks like. I'm not going to use these guys when they get older because I don't want to embarrass them. But I got 2 twin sons. And many of y'all know that have been dads. The kids teach you a lot. Not necessarily good lessons, but they do teach you a lot, right? I got one son, even though they're twins, I got one son that's overconfident. And I got one son that's underconfident. They were born on the same day. They have very different personalities. And I know their personalities will change. They're still very little. I'm not worried about it. But I am already having to deal with it. I got one son that's so overconfident that he's brash sometimes. As in, he'll see Riley Steffen sitting across at the restaurant, get off my lap, walk and get in her lap, and steal all her food off her plate. Now, when you're 1 year old, that's cute. When you're a teenager, that's rude, right? You can't do that forever. He's way overconfident, and it's a problem. My other son's underconfident, and it's also a problem. I need him to do things sometimes, and he doesn't want to do it. I want him to go outside and talk to someone. He won't do it. He would rather stay with mama. So as you see, I got a Jacob and an Esau. Joke's on them. Neither of them are receiving an inheritance. Do I need to make this one more confident and this one less confident? Or do I need instead to teach them both courage? Do you see how I think that there's a difference here? Instead of just trying to think about, well, your personality is like this, you need to change your personality to be more like this. Your personality is like this, you should change your personality to be more like this. Instead, I could reject it all and just say, no, we're going to be courageous. And where do we learn about courage? We learn about courage from the Christ. Does courage get things done? Absolutely, it gets things done. And sometimes we have to do what's right, even when it's not easy. And we learn that from the Christ on the cross. That's what we need to focus on. And I'm not worried about this personality stuff. I'm worried more about how can I be courageous like the Christ, right? And finally here, courage, that type of courage of the Christ, it is tenderhearted. One of my boys broke me the other day. One brother threw his food on the ground because he's a dummy. And he's hungry, but he threw his food on the ground. We put their little, tables together. And I had one son split his food in half and just put it on his brother's plate. Is that brash? Or is that tenderhearted? That's more what we're trying to gun for, right? It's possible. It's possible for all of us, but we need the Christ to do it. Thank you for your close attention. If there's anyone here that needs to obey the gospel, if there's anyone here that needs the prayers of the congregation, that takes courage. It takes courage to ask for help, but we all need the help of Christ. If there's any way we can assist, why don't you come forward as we stand and as we sing?